Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I've had many ways of approaching this topic, and I started by writing them down, and I got 7 pages down, and then I thought, no, this is too complex, I'd better put it into a PowerPoint, and as I developed the PowerPoint, it went in a slightly different direction. So you will get the benefit of both, or the or the weight of both. When Benedict XVI wrote his, it's not actually an encyclical, is it? It is apostolic exhortation or something like that. Maximum Illud. He never mentions universities. He does mention it once about the formation of the missionaries. In other words, that they should go to the Urbaniana or somewhere similar. But he doesn't mention the universities as in his vision of what missions are, which is interesting because it shows there's still a very, very Eurocentric perspective. In other words, that mission countries were not places where you would find universities or set up universities. And although this work that he was producing, this document that he was producing was so revolutionary, it was after the First World War, and as I explained in the blurb that I sent out, after the First World War, Benedict XV was a very intelligent and wide viewed man. I think he'd come from the diplomatic service, and anyway, he had a wide view of the world, and during the First World War he avoided supporting either of the sides. He said both of the sides were wrong, and that they should stop the war, and they were causing tremendous damage to Europe and to many parts of the world, because the colonies of the European countries were sending people to fight in the trenches in Europe, and the youth of Europe was being decimated. And he used the funds of the Vatican to provide support, what we would now call first aid support, campaign hospitals and that sort of things to support whatever was going on. And in the end, because it said that both sides were wrong, and when the armistice was imposed on Germany, he said that the weight of the cost for the war was going to be carried by the German country, by the German people, and that they were not really to blame. It had been their leaders who had been involved in the war, and their leaders meanwhile had stepped down. He said this was going to crush the German people, and then parts of Germany were being cut off as Europe's frontiers were redesigned, and nationalist spirits were coming up in various countries in Europe and abroad. And the Pope said, watch out, this way we will head to another war. And is true enough, it happened. Meanwhile, looking out on the world, he seems to have understood that this Europe, which controlled the world through its colonies, was coming to an end, and so that we should rethink the way the Church is present in other parts of the world. The Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Latin Catholic Church, had traveled the world very much on the back of the outgoing colonial countries. Exactly, the colonizers. I think of Portugal, especially in the case of Portugal, the Portuguese, not having many people and not much money used the missions as a form of administering their colonies. And so they paid the missionaries as an extension of the civil service. Even here in Macau, the priests would earn a salary as civil servants when Portugal stepped back. The priests in Macau diocese ceased to receive their salary, which caused some problems. Okay, so it's in this context that we listen to words of Benedict, which says like this: before he returned to his Father, our Lord Jesus Christ addressed to his disciples the words, "Go into the whole world and preach the gospel to all creation." With these words, he committed to them a duty, a momentous, a holy charge that was not to lapse with the death of the apostles, but would bind their successors one after another until the end of the world, as long, that is, as there remained on this earth men whom the truth might set free, whom the truth might set free. So my first topic will be this question of truth, the Church's mission to seek and proclaim the truth. Let's look at this is what I just read to you, and we will move on. In two documents which I will look at, one document produced by John Paul II, his Apostolic Constitution Ex Corde Ecclesiae, and the second one on Pope Francis's recent Apostolic Constitution Gaudium Veritate, which deals with ecclesiastical faculties and universities, but has principles which I think apply generally to Catholic universities. In this, we see right at the beginning, Pope Francis says, "The joy of truth expresses the restlessness of the human heart until it encounters and dwells within God's light and shares that light with all people. He alone, in revealing the mystery of the Father and of his love, fully reveals humanity to itself and brings to light its very high calling." So this joy of truth, which expresses the restlessness of the human heart. This is a reference to St. Augustine, as you all know, to his Confessions. The search for truth as something which is part of our human condition. And it is in this area of search for truth that both John Paul II and Pope Francis place the work of the university. What is the nature of a Catholic university? St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that grace does not remove or eliminate nature, but makes it perfect. In other words, Catholic university is not something which is distinct from universities in general. It is one of genus, let us call it, of universities. And universities are of various types, and you can find liberal arts universities, you can find teaching universities, research universities, technical universities, and there is no issue in our considering that there might be Catholic teaching universities, Catholic liberal arts universities, Catholic technical universities. In other words, when we are talking about a Catholic university, we are talking about a variety of different species, let us say. So if we are looking to hear in these words of the popes what USJ should be, it doesn't immediately give us an answer, because I actually wrote down something like this. Let me add a further layer to this complexity. An oak or a pine tree is not simply defined by its label as a species. Each single oak is unique. It has been affected by a countless number of circumstances: light, water, soil, wind damage, diseases, and has shown its resilience by adapting to them, building always on what has gone before. The Chinese and Japanese have a long tradition of cultivating trees in small pots, which I appreciate because I have a number of them. The bonsais, they are called in Japan. If you ever go to a bonsai exhibition, you will see how the same species of tree has grown and been trained in a variety of forms that are pleasing to the eye. There is clearly a guiding hand from the bonsai owner, and he or she can do an amazing amount to make the little tree grow this way or that. But ultimately it is the tree itself that surprises them by pushing out a shoot where it was not expected, or dying off here and there whilst renewing its vigor on another side. And so bonsais are a sort of dialogue between the gardener, so to speak, or the bonsai owner, and the life of the tree. And this is true of my experience of university. University is this dialogue between those who are managing the university and then the life of the students, the staff, the administrative staff, who show their talents. And if you have too much of a top-down idea about what university you want, you may find that the people don't fit into it. And if you just simply let the people do what they like, then you may find a rather chaotic situation. So you have to have this permanent dialogue, internal dialogue, it is, as speaking from the rector's point of view, where I try to understand what people are trying to do and see the potential and see how it fits in with the rest of the university and how it is financially viable and how it can fit into the perspectives of the local government, the circumstances of the local Catholic Church. So you see, this is the reality of working with a university. But what is it that makes it Catholic? And because what I've been saying could be for any university. John Paul II, in his Apostolic Constitution, which is from 1990, if I'm not mistaken, says, I broke down his first sentence, or first paragraph, born from the heart, he says, is what the Catholic University is, born from the heart of the Church. The Catholic University is located in that tradition which may be traced back to the very origin of the university as an institution. It has always been recognized as an incomparable center of creativity and dissemination of knowledge for the good of humanity. Pope Francis uses another expression. He's a sort of providential cultural laboratory in which the Church carries out the performative interpretation of the reality brought about by the Christ event and nourished by the gifts of wisdom and knowledge. But to continue with John Paul, by vocation, the Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium is dedicated to research, to teaching, and to the education of students who freely associate with their teachers in a common love of knowledge. This is the ideal. Let me remind you that in the Middle Ages, the universities arose for various reasons. In some places, they initially were schools connected to cathedrals and then became more or less autonomous. In other cases, it was kings or who set them up. In the case of Bologna, which I have mentioned several times, the University of Bologna was set up by the students themselves, who had then hired the teachers, hired and fired the teachers, which quite different. But in all these universities, what we notice is that they try to break away from the control of the political and even sometimes the ecclesiastical authorities who might close down the freedom to research and develop their thinking. And so what came about was that these universities appealed to the Pope, asking the Pope to grant the degrees. So the first granting of degrees in Middle Age universities became a granting of degrees by papal authority, which allowed a person then, once they had got their degree, they could travel to other universities across frontiers which were nothing like our frontiers nowadays in the Middle Ages, and you could study with one teacher in Bologna and then travel to Paris because you wanted to try to be a teacher in Paris, and they would recognize your studies from Bologna. And this was how this Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium developed, and that is what is in the memory of John Paul II when he is writing that. With every other university, it shares that, so here John Paul is saying this is common to all universities. It shares that gaudium de veritate. Notice the similarity to Pope Francis's expression, so precious to St. Augustine, which is that joy of searching for, discovering, and communicating truth in every field of knowledge. In every field of knowledge, there is this joy of discovering the truth. I don't know whether you have reached that point in your studies, when you struggle with the notes from your lectures, or when you go to the library and you read a book which is difficult to understand, and then suddenly there's a light bulb moment, and wow, yes, you see, you suddenly see. Sometimes you've been hearing lots of words or reading lots of words, and it's opaque, and then suddenly you see. Yes, and that discovery is something unique that we experience. We experience something similar when we are contemplating beauty. Also, that is also something that you see, and there's a moment when you appreciate it. I remember showing the icon of the Blessed Trinity, Rublyov's icon of the Blessed Trinity in my Revelation and Tradition classes, and asking the sisters whether they appreciated it, and I can't remember which of you said no, that they didn't like it. And then I explained, I tried to show the various points of the icon and how it is much more subtle and profound than one initially thinks. And at the end I asked, now do you like the icon? And it seemed that I had got something across. So to learn to appreciate beauty is also something. There is a spontaneous appreciation of beauty, but there is also an educated appreciation of beauty. To learn to appreciate certain types of music, to learn to appreciate certain types of painting or architecture. So this is the joy of searching for, discovering, and communicating truth. That's why I like teaching. So this is what happened. So all these universities, the top ones are ones which are no longer Catholic. Bologna, St. Paul's College is a ruin. Coimbra University is now a public university. There you have the Sacre Cuore, which is a Catholic university in Milan. Here you have Fordham University, here between the trees. I can't remember which one that is between the trees. That is Rio de Janeiro. This is Sophia University, because I got it because of the sakura blossom. It's very difficult to see with this picture. But okay, so there are Catholic universities of all types and spread out all over the world. It's a big network of universities still today. And many of the older universities were Catholic universities in other times and have since been removed from the control of the church. John Paul II, in that same apostolic constitution, then mentions his personal experience. He says, "For many years I myself was deeply enriched by the beneficial experience of university life, the ardent search for truth, its unselfish transmission to youth," the work that we put in preparing our classes to, and then correcting your papers. All those learning to think rigorously, this challenge to think rigorously, and then be challenged whether you are explaining your ideas correctly. It's not just repeating what the professor said, but being able to explain them. Even if you say something that is not what the professor said, or that sometimes the professor may not agree with, if you are able to explain why you say it, for us that is already something gained. And why to learn to think rigorously so as to act rightly and serve humanity better. So this service of humanity is at the heart of a Catholic university. And let's see what I've got on my next slide. Recently, I went to a congress in Puebla. And during that congress, right in the beginning, there was a very interesting talk by a lady. I think she's Norwegian nowadays. She is teaching in Manchester, in England. And she did a doctorate, it seems, studying Portuguese professors, which I hadn't, the publications by Portuguese academics. And she talks about the fragmentation of knowledge, which has increased with each academic field, an epistemological and methodological law unto itself. This has been going on for a couple of centuries, whereas before there was a, so to speak, community of thinkers. Nowadays they tend to each think within their own fields and consider that their methods and their understanding of what is true in their field is not immediately transposed to other areas. I mean, if you're studying literature or if you're studying biology, they seem to be very different fields and seem to be dealing with completely different methodologies. She entitles her article, which I went to look at the abstract, "The Tale of a Predatory Discourse." This is the idea that whole areas of human wisdom and knowledge are being excluded. That professor up there, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who is a left-wing sociologist, curiously raises this problem because of what is happening in the Amazon. He says the knowledge the Amazon tribes have of relating to their environment without destroying it, where they have lived for hundreds and thousands of years, is a knowledge which would be very useful for the wider community if it accepted it as valuable knowledge. In fact, the anthropologist on whose work I did my doctoral thesis, curiously a doctoral thesis on theology, which was on a poet and anthropologist, he worked in East Timor, and in East Timor he became aware that the Portuguese who were going to East Timor to develop the coffee production were using techniques from Europe, which was to knock down the trees and make whatever it's, I don't know how you'd call it in English. How do they, the rice paddies when you make them terraces, so making terraces and that sort of. But they hadn't taken into account the torrential rains in East Timor and the fact that they'd cut down the trees, which the East Timorese considered to be sacred forests or woods or sacred trees. There was a reason for them to be sacred. It's because when you knocked them down and the rains came and everything went away. And so what he did was he went to Oxford to do his doctorate in anthropology, to study the East Timorese culture, to see what was valuable in this East Timorese culture that could be developed into a new synthesis in which East Timor could be developed with a respect for these ancient wise traditions and the knowledge that comes with modern science and technology. So this weakens the fact that there is this predatory discourse which allows only certain things to be considered as knowledge. In fact, it excludes in many universities in Latin Europe, it excludes theology, for example. Many universities in Europe, in the south of Europe, will not have theology as a faculty or teaching because they consider that it is confessional and it is subjective, and so it has nothing to do with the university forum. This weakens the approach to complex issues, and we will look at how they are complex, faced today by local communities which call for multidisciplinary approach. We are faced with what this lady, Karen Bennett, calls the ideological imperialism manifest in editorial decisions about what counts as knowledge in today's world. In other words, these academics that she was studying, the difficulty they had in getting their papers published if they didn't publish them according to what were considered the criteria of their peer reviewers. In other words, everyone applauds peer review and so on and so forth, but peer review can also be restrictive. There is an interesting book on the development of science, I forget its name, I've got it at home, which shows how systematically, even in the scientific fields, new ideas, new discoveries are excluded because they don't correspond to the orthodoxy within a particular field of science. So this is an issue which universities should be able to counter if they work as communities of academics and scholars. In other words, if we overcome what I said in that same meeting in Puebla, what is this tyranny of the publish or die is having an effect on something which is basic in the university, which is the dimension of its community. I explained this by going to my experience when I went to Shanghai some years ago, and I went to one of the centers in Shanghai set up by the Chinese government to study what is happening in the area of education, because China takes education very seriously, and so it has research centers following what is happening in the various areas. And they gave us a very interesting analysis of what was happening in Macau, because they had come to Macau to have a look. They couldn't tell us everything because it had been a government-funded project, and so they had to keep most of it secret, but they were able to let us know enough details for us to know what the failures and the difficulties are in the Macau system. And they said, look, what we are working on at the moment is that we are worried that this requirement that universities are ranked by the number of publications of their professors means that in our universities, as soon as the professor finishes his classes, he or she goes back to their office to produce more papers, so as to try and publish the papers. And so the interaction with students outside the classroom is next to none. And as Professor, I think it was Keith Morrison, reminded us in a colloquium at the beginning of this academic year, was it the beginning of this year, or was it last year? Last year, in which Professor Stephen Morgan was one of the speakers. He reminded us that 80% of what students learn at university is learned from their colleagues, not from their professors. And the other part of that study is that 60% of what they learn from their colleagues is wrong. And so how do you respond to that? You respond that, why is it that people learn outside the classroom? Because they're learning, because they're talking round the coffee table or exchanging notes or discussing points which for them are interesting that have come up in what they have been reading. If the professors were also part of that conversation, if there were common areas where people sit down together to have their coffee together or to discuss, this probably introduce a balancing point from the professors who would be able to help the students know what in their discussions was more likely to be right than wrong. And so it would be a continued learning environment, not only classes and library, but a learning, informal learning, which is so important for our development. Let me just show you, the United Nations has set up a series of goals, 17 goals to transform our world. I was talking about the complexity of the challenges that we are facing. And these too small for you to see, but you can see this: poverty, zero hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water, etc. Clean air, life below the water, life above on land. How do you face all these challenges? And that lady I was talking about a moment ago, she said the tendency is to push these into separate sections. Say, look, marine science, you look into keeping the waters clean. Agricultural, look into the agriculture. But these problems are complex because they go across borders. They touch the economy, they touch politics, they touch people's aspirations. What are their objectives in life? What do they consider to be a good life? And all these must be brought together. And so she says something which is unexpected to come from a layperson. She says, I'm just fitting in Pope Francis meanwhile. He says, we daily see signs that things are now reaching a breaking point due to the rapid pace of change and degradation. This is in the document about ecclesiastical faculties and universities. The problem is that we still lack the culture necessary to confront this crisis. We lack leadership capable of striking out on new paths. In other words, something that we need to help develop are leaders, people able to think these problems in their complex fashion and respecting the different levels of reality. Well, what the lady said, Kerry Fassa said, what would it look like if we in universities took seriously the complexity and dynamism of the world when we think about creating sustainable futures? How do we develop a wise university? In other words, the idea of wisdom being brought in, not just accumulation of knowledge and ability to use the methodologies of your particular field of knowledge, but also this wisdom which comes from understanding that there are many fields of approach to a given issue, and that wisdom comes from being able to balance these out, and so we get the right idea. Okay. So what does Paul VI say about a wise university? He said many years ago, in 1967, talking about the development of our world, he said, the development of peoples essential for attaining justice and peace worldwide must be well-rounded. It must foster the development of each person and of the whole person. It also speaks of the need for wise people in search of a new humanism, one which will enable people to find themselves. So it would be good that a Catholic university could have this as its aim, to produce wise people, wise leaders, people who are familiar, although they are not experts, with various fields of learning. Benedict XVI is going down the same line. Pope Benedict XVI spoke of the urgent need to experience, and this is Pope Francis writing about Pope Benedict XVI, for those of you who've seen the film The Two Popes, to experience and to steer the globalization of humanity in relational terms. In other words, not only see it in terms of economic exchanges and political challenges, but in relational terms. For this actually to take place, he invites us to broaden the scope of reason. Is reason only that reason that we use, the microscope and technological, is that reason? You remember the reason of enlightenment that expelled the gods as they saw it, or the religion. You don't know about that, but the Enlightenment in the 18th century said that reason was supreme, and they understood by reason a very rational, rationalistic perspective, very positivistic. And at the French Revolution, they kicked out the popes. Actually, its effect was kicking out the pope from Rome, but they kicked out the priests and the bishops, and they enthroned the goddess of reason. They carried through the streets of Paris. And then they guillotined people left, right, and center. So it was a strange sort of reason. And we saw in the 20th century the effects of this reason gone wild, with world wars, technological applications of knowledge to creation of more powerful armaments and destructive atomic bombs and so on. So reason does not necessarily bring a more reason in that narrow sense. So there are different types of reason, and we should understand that there are different types of reason. Before you all get too bored. Pope Francis explains, although he's talking specifically to theologians and philosophers, he is really putting out this idea that our thinking should be open. In other words, we should should always be seeking to understand more. He says, the good theologian and philosopher has an open, that is, an incomplete thought, always open to the maius of God and of the truth, always in development according to the law that St. Vincent of Lerins described in these words, annis consolidatur, dilatetur tempore, sublimetur etate. In other words, as Francis explains in one of his homilies in the Santa Marta Hotel where he lives, the truths of the church strengthen with the years, develop with time, and become deeper with age. And this should be our perspective, to grow in knowledge and never get stuck too much in one set of theories or ideologies or perspectives. Let me move on to evangelization. Still got some time? I meant to keep you for about an hour and then ask you some questions, but or for you to ask me. But let's start with evangelization. Maybe I got the wrong. Yeah, I updated it on my computer in the university, but this version is the previous one. Let's see if it updates automatically. If I switch it off and on again. I'll give it a moment to update. I can see there's an update going on. And I will start reading. Evangelization lies at the heart of Christian identity. Pope Paul VI states it clearly in his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Nunciandi. He in fact says it's the very nature of the church. It summed up the work of one of the first bishop synods after the council and clarifies much that had been in the air at that meeting and was a leitmotif of its documents, but was nowhere dealt with in a systematic fashion. Let's see if this meanwhile is, so I can give you the texts. And now I don't think I've got any further. Sorry, I probably switched off my computer badly. So you will just have to bear with me and listen to it from here. When the council put all its authority into describing the nature and mission of the church in the dogmatic constitution Lumen Gentium, it was faced with a dilemma which to a large extent lies at the heart of the subsequent schism by Monsignor Lefebvre and his followers. Pope John the 23rd's call for a council that would be open to the world and build bridges for unity between the many branches of Christianity had led to the questioning of certain classifications that appeared to make it easier to define the church and her mission. The old dictum, extra ecclesia nulla salus, you may have heard of that, outside the church there is no salvation, had provided a comfortable world view. We are the saved. Those outside the church are plunged into darkness in a world tainted by original sin and accumulated infidelities of humankind. This would be an easy way of looking at things. Through a process similar to Occam's razor, some followed the dictum to extremes of exclusions. The unbaptized were excluded from salvation. Even innocent children who died at birth could not enter heaven but must reside for all eternity in limbo, which was a creation of St. Augustine and his contemporaries from the worldview of ancient Rome. I was surprised rereading Virgil's Aeneid once, and when I found the exact description of limbo as the children who had died on being born in a special area where they're still not part of the community. Even Orthodox Christians and Protestants were at risk because they had placed themselves outside the real church. The position of the magisterium had always moderated that view, which questions the power of God's mercy, but his revealed intention to save all mankind. Questions his power of God's mercy and his intention to save all mankind. So, if we read Lumen Gentium, it will explain that this is true. If someone is clearly convinced that the Catholic Church is where is fully expressed that communion in a sacramental form, that communion of love with God, which is salvation, and that person refuses that, then they have excluded themselves from salvation. But then the same council says that a person can be a part of the church, and if they do not persevere in charity, they also are not saved. Then it goes on to explain what raised the problems to Monsignor Lefebvre, and is the issue that faces us here as we in an area where Christianity is in a minority, and so we are talking about how we can present our message to the world around us. The Council deals openly with this challenge in Lumen Gentium 13 to 16. There it sets out widening circles drawn around Christ and his saving work, and explains one by one how they are ordered to the kingdom. All are called to be part of this Catholic unity of the people of God, which in promoting universal peace presages it. In other words, all are called to be part of this communion, which in being promoted by the church is already the beginning of that peace to which we all desire. And they belong to or are related to it in various ways. The Catholic faithful, all who believe in Christ, and indeed the whole humankind, for all are called by the grace of God to salvation. Okay, so if all are called, and then the Council goes on to explain the catechumens, those who are Christians, the Jewish people, the Mohammedans, those who in shadows and images seek the unknown God, those who through no fault of their own have not received the gospel, yet sincerely follow the dictates of their conscience, even those who have not arrived at a knowledge of God, but do their best to live a good life. You can say, well, after such a list, one could well ask, what work is left for the church's missions? Everyone is saved. And the Council ends with two very interesting topics. Let me just turn the page. These two interesting topics, just briefly in one phrase, if I can find them. Who is left, I repeat, for the Church to evangelize? What should be the driving motive for our mission ad gentes? The Council provides an answer which is both elegant and evangelical. It says, but often people deceived by the evil one have become vain in their reasoning and have exchanged the truth of God for a lie, serving the creature rather than the creator. This is something it is not exclusive to those who are outside Christianity. It is we ourselves are constantly tempted to follow gods, so to speak, who become very important in our lives. Or there are some who, living and dying in this world without God, are exposed to final despair. So the objective, the dynamic of a mission is to help people who, if they look around at the world around them, they see wars, they see sicknesses, they see evil, and they might think, well, this is a violent world, it's not worthwhile living in a world like this. They might despair. And what we bring to this is a story that we are all loved by God. And Paul VI, then in the Evangelii Nuntiandi, he explains that in a text which unfortunately is missing, which he says, we have this honor of knowing that the author of all creation is a Father who loves us, and that his love for us is such that we can call him Father, and that we can consider each other brothers and sisters in God. In other words, this is a word of hope that we bring, not as a theoretical expression that we teach to other people, but we express to other people through our care and our interest for them in their lives. And now, how do we turn this care for others into something that changes their lives? That same Paul VI in Evangelii Nuntiandi says this: evangelization means bringing the good news into all strata of humanity. In other words, it's not only just telling people about this, it's also changing the circumstances in which they live. It is a question not only of preaching the gospel in ever wider geographic areas or to ever greater numbers of people, but also of affecting and, as it were, upsetting through the power of the gospel humanity's criteria of judgment, determining values, points of interest, lines of thought, sources of inspiration, and models of life. Now, how do these things change? They change, obviously, by people who are actually in the workplace or in the family or in the community, and who change the example they give to other people. But we have to go deeper, and we have to understand that some of these values and these perspectives cannot just be spoken like that in such a technical and developed world like us, like that in which we live. They have to be deeply embedded into the very economic systems that we develop, the way we understand and work in our politics, the way the research projects that we select in our scientific research, in our health research. In other words, all the areas of academic life are areas which should face this challenge. And let me just move on to the final two slides in which I talk about this. What I see as a challenge for us here at USJ. First, I think we are in a privileged position because we are in China, and in China the position of scholars' work and scholars is valued from a very deep cultural tradition. It goes right back the beginning, about the 4th century BC. Ancient texts describe Chinese society as divided into 4 classes: the scholar elite, the landowners and the farmers and the craftsmen, etc. So the scholar elite whose exemplar was Confucius, directed the moral education of the people. So there's a great respect for scholarly life and the work carried out by scholars, which we should be able to make use of. We should be able to understand better this Chinese culture, which has so many values. And I think this is something that we have been studying, whether we can set up at USJ a Center for the Study of Chinese Culture, which could not only have lines of research on Chinese culture, but also provide teaching for all students who come to USJ, including those at FRS, that besides their normal curriculum, they should also have some extracurricular modules, not just to add to the weight, but for you to understand a bit of the richness of the culture and history of this country in which you are studying. It is a pity that you come here and study here for 4 or 5 years, and you may learn about Western philosophy and theology, and you know very little about what it is that China has, and that was the reason that the Jesuits dedicated so much of their energy into setting up centers here, such as the College of St. Paul and then this seminary, to prepare people to be able to dialogue with that culture. Also, the international mix of our students is something that is important for dialogue between cultural traditions. We have here a good example of how diverse USJ can be, and if we are able to exchange the knowledge from our various cultures and understanding the wisdom from our various cultures, that is an enrichment. The international team of academics, we should be able to bring the wisdom of East and West into dialogue with each of the academic fields at USJ, not simply repeat what we find in our textbooks from the United States or from Europe or from wherever. There is something unique and rich about this culture that we live in Macau, which has for centuries been on this borderline between East and West. Networking for research and student exchange with mainland departments of Chinese classics and culture for carrying on this that I'm talking about. And then from John Paul II's Ex Corde Ecclesiae, there are a number of topics which fit in beautifully with that objective. He says, all the basic academic activities of a Catholic university are connected with and in harmony with the evangelizing mission of the Church. And he gives examples. Research, which puts new human discoveries at the service of individuals and society. In other words, always aware that we are not simply contributing to the interests of a government or the interests of particular companies, but that we are, the ultimate aim is the community and the well-being of the community and the people in the community. Education, offered in a faith context that forms men and women capable of rational and critical judgment and conscious of the transcendent dignity of the human person. This morning I was talking to Teresa Long, and she was saying how she was hesitating about sending her children to Catholic or non-Catholic school, and then in the end, for her, the importance of them having a certain Catholic background in their education was a very important criteria in her option. Professional training that incorporates ethical values and a sense of service to individuals and to society. What we were talking about, the need for leaders in society, wise leaders, this professional training so that leaders know how to act ethically in the moments when they have to take decisions. That's when pressures are on them from various sides for them to decide this way or decide that way. How do you have the structure, internal structure, to be able to take the right decision because it is right decision, not because it is more people pulling that way than that way. Dialogue with culture that makes faith better understood, and finally, theological research that translates the faith into contemporary language. By contemporary language, we mean perhaps contemporary languages, because we are talking about many different communities or different levels of community, and what you are learning is to be able to be translators of the faith on a permanent basis in whatever community you may find yourselves. In other words, you are translating at the moment into certain types of more contemporary language, but that is an exercise that you are then to use afterwards creatively in the areas where you find yourselves, in the particular communities in which you find yourselves. And I have run out of slides, so we will finish there. Thank you very much.
Father Peter, thank you very much. This time last week, Father Peter and I were at Renmin University of China in Beijing, a university 15 or 16 times larger than the University of St. Joseph. And so it's appropriate perhaps that you use the image of a bonsai. Maybe we could call USJ a bonsai university in that context. I'm sure there will be questions. I want to play around with this idea of epistemicide, the idea of killing of truth, which seems to me to be an interesting concept. Killing of knowledge, thank you. Professor of epistemology. Questions? Silence.
I'll just give you feedback on that on the bonsai. Quickly. I used it in my, when I took over USJ as one of my objectives, because I knew we had a small university. And shortly afterwards, I went to the Ministry of Education in Beijing to say that we have a university and we would like to develop it and recruit students from mainland China, etc. And the gentleman in charge was very polite and so on, and then he said, and how many students do you have? I said, well, we have 1,200. Ha, ha, ha. He said, you know, the faculty of whatever here has 12,000 students. And I said, well, yes, but small seeds produce big bushes. And I thought that was a very biblical image. I don't know whether you recognize the biblical allusion. There is also a Portuguese joke about that issue of numbers, if I can tell you a joke. At the time after the revolution in Portugal, when Portugal was thinking of handing back Macau to China, and China was not very interested. So a team came from Portugal. They went to Beijing and asked to be received by Mao Zedong. And someone went in to tell Mao Zedong, look, the Portuguese are out there, they want to negotiate Macau. And said, Portuguese, yes, small country in Western Europe. Well, how many of them? 10 million. So what hotel are they at?
It's very good. I also noticed, incidentally, that you said that you were going to finish and then you were going to ask us questions. And I saw the students flinching slightly. But you get to ask questions. So, questions? You might have got off lightly. No questions? None whatsoever? Father Lawrence, you must have a question. No? Well, perhaps then I can take advantage of having the microphone and being in charge, at least, of the microphone, if nothing else. And to ask you, Father Peter, whether you think that you used that expression from Thomas Aquinas, that grace doesn't kill nature, it perfects it. Do you think that it's something that ought to be obvious when one enters a Catholic university, that it is a Catholic university, as opposed to entering another university? When you go to visit a place, should you be able to sense that grace perfecting the nature of a university? And if so, how might one identify those aspects, and how can we build those aspects more perfectly?
We were talking a while ago at the Dean's meeting about whether we should have a new theme for the Open Day, whether it should be sustainable development or something like that. And then the reaction of some of the deans was that, well, we haven't thought enough about that and we're not living that in our faculties. And so if we put up on our propaganda that Open Day is about sustainable development, and then people come and see that we really haven't gone very far in thinking about it and carrying it out, there would be a probability that they would think this is all just a veneer, something stuck on the surface. I think something similar should be said about calling ourselves a Catholic university. We should take care about the way we use the expression. It is not enough to have a cross in our campus and a chapel in our campus, or crosses on in our classrooms. There has to be something, as Professor Stephen was suggesting in his question, that people will immediately notice. And I think what they should immediately notice, although these external signs are not to be excluded, they should notice it at the level of the human relations, the way, the procedures that we follow, and when we try to do things, that we don't always necessarily get things right, but that we try to do them correctly, respecting people and their ideas. Something in that way. What we were talking about is the relationship between teachers and students, the community that is set up between them. I think this is important. I think here at FRS you have a particularly good example of the close relationship that exists, but it's a special situation because you are studying theology. Everything seems to point in that direction. Professor José Simões here with his programs in communication and media, his students turn to him as if he was their father, and some of them need this fatherly help. And he cares for them and looks after them, and he knows their names, and he follows them up after they finish their courses. He is a unique case, but in general, I think people should feel happy at the university. Universities are complex places. They are not, it's not the Wild West outside, and inside the university then it's all peace and quiet. There are ambitions, there are rivalries, there are irritations that professors have with other professors, and thinking that the other professors' ideas are things that are unacceptable, and So there are often very deep tensions in the university, and sometimes some underground wars going on, which one has to be able to detect and to manage, helping people find solutions. Sometimes the solutions have to be drastic. Speaking from my own experience, sometimes you have to take sharp decisions about closing things down or telling people that they no longer got a place in the university, and this has to be some courage there, from my point of view, because the good of this community life cannot be dependent on someone having crazy ideas or doing crazy things. So there are rules, but those rules seek to respect everyone in their ways and being. All these documents, the popes say Catholic University should have room for all those seeking the truth, whether they're Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, any other religion, or no religion at all. And we have that in our mission statement. So, and I can tell you that it is not necessarily from those who are not Christians or not Catholics that you have problems. It has to do with other dimensions, which has to do with personalities, has to do with ideas, and so we are a community, and a community like a large family. You know what it's like to have a small family and to organize a small family. Well, a large family with 1,200 brothers and sisters has its ups and downs, and sometimes this person is sad, and sometimes this person has had some tragedy in their life, and sometimes there's been enthusiasms that we must be able to follow up and live with as well. Sorry.
No, thank you very much. I'm interested to hear about these underground walls, actually. I think the only underground wars in the Faculty of Religious Studies, at least in the faculty office, is over who gets to the coffee first in the mornings. The answer is me, usually. Are there any other questions? No? Well, thank you, Father Peter, for ending our lecture series in an... Did I miss a question? I did miss a question. Excellent.
Brenda can translate.
Ask 校長呢8年嚟喺澳門 USJ 嗰個工作，不斷咁喺同中國大陸政府高等教育方面去發展。咁佢今次去北京，似乎個機會係幾好，同埋個進展係幾好嘅。咁未來喺澳門政府同澳門教育區嘅幫助之下，有冇可能實現到喺大陸招生入 USJ？
Let me try the translation. Yeah, it's about Father Peter's recent trip to Beijing and mainland. This lady is asking whether there is a possibility to recruit a mainland student or develop connections with or extend our program into China, something like that. After your visit to Beijing, with dialogue to the governmental officials and whatsoever, academics, things like that. I hope my translation.
She probably won't understand my answer. Well, China is a huge opportunity for the Church, and we are the only Catholic university on Chinese territory. So, as someone said to me in a message today, Father Cicada, who is a long-time observer of these issues, he said, what can I translate it to you? USJ is the great priority of the church in China. Because of what I tried to say, not in a very ordered way, about this issue of evangelization, this dialogue in the various areas of knowledge. We are small, but I think we bring a very important interface between what is the Catholic Church, which is not just the church in Europe. The Catholic Church understood as a worldwide Catholic Church, and with all its wisdom and its knowledge and its China, which at the moment is embarked on opening up to the world, and the One Belt, One Road policy. In other words, China intends to meet with other cultures, and we have that potential. Whether China sees that potential or considers that it is the right moment to make use of that potential is not in my hands to say. That it depends on the Chinese authorities and the way they assess the situation. What we can do and what the government has asked us to do, the local government and the Ministry of Education, is to develop lines of research and interchange or exchange of students and staff, and that was one of the main reasons that took us to Beijing. And in that Renmin University, they showed great interest in working with us, knowing that the university is helping the diocese develop its archives and developing a library here which brings not only new but also ancient texts onto Chinese soil, allowing Chinese scholars, whether church scholars or civil scholars, to come and study. That is something we are working on, and we believe that Chinese scholars will find interesting, and Renmin University scholars are certainly interested in coming to see what can be done. Some of them had been here in the summer for the ICLA conference when there was a round table, and they actually worked here in this building, in the older part of the building, and were delighted to be in a 17th, 18th century building with all the museum nearby, and they went upstairs to see all the artifacts upstairs, all the things that are photographs of the missionaries. So USJ punches above its weight in that sense. We have more of interest to provide than the size of our university seems to show. Why is it that the authorities don't let us recruit from mainland China? No one really seems to know. I suppose someone must know, but it's not anyone I have ever talked to. And then there's a cultural issue which we have to wait and see how things come about. I was talking to a Macanese person on Friday at dinner, and he said, well, in China, one of the ways China has of saying no is to say yes. So one never knows what is going to happen. It's not worth going into speculation. We will wait and see. And when the time is ripe, it will happen.
I might add to that our Holy Father and his immediate predecessor often make a distinction between evangelization and proselytization. And there's an analogy with the recruiting of students. The distinction that is offered, well, originally quite in his characteristically subtle way by Benedict XVI, was to suggest that what the Christian church does is to propose Jesus Christ. Not to impose Jesus Christ, not even to try and sell Jesus Christ to people, but simply to propose Jesus Christ. And that human beings who come into contact with that proposition, at least if it's given in a manner that is bespeaks the integrity of the people proposing Jesus, people find him unbelievably attractive, and it transforms their life. And part of what we were doing last week in China was to propose USJ to people, to simply say, as we said on a number of occasions in conversation, we're here at your service. We want to be at the service of China. In our conversations with the scholars at Renmin and with a couple of other scholars at Peking University, what we experienced was curious minds in the same place. Universities are often like that. You're with people who are engaged with ideas, with interesting things, they want to talk about them. And we were proposing USJ in the way that a Christian might propose Jesus Christ, as something that is attractive because of its character. Now you have to be patient. Anybody who's ever been engaged in any form of evangelization knows that you might sow the seed by proposing Jesus Christ today, and it might not come to be harvested for a long, long time. But that doesn't mean you should stop sowing the seed. And I think there was a lot of that about our experience last week. Father Peter, thank you very much for closing our lecture series with such an interesting approach to thinking about the role of the university in the mission of the church here in East Asia. Thank you, particularly the students of this faculty who have faithfully missed their supper, month in, month out, to be spoken to by their professors who they might think they hear enough of during the day. You've often asked questions, although not today, and you've, I hope, gained a great deal from hearing us, members of this faculty, address this question which Benedict XV first proposed now 101 years ago. 101 years ago. Thank you, the rest of you who have come, sometimes to one or more of the lectures. This is an important part of the mission of a university, to offer lectures for people to come and just simply hear what is going on within the university and to understand how the university fits into the life of the place. And here, the life of this extraordinarily special place that is Macau, this extraordinary place of the mixing of cultures. What one of our guest speakers, our guests at the Macau Theological Colloquium that we had in December described as, and she was born and brought up here, but I'm going to say it too, my beautiful home, Macau. Thank you very much for coming, and you can go home now, you can get some supper. There won't be any more lectures in the evening, at least not for the next couple of months, but thank you very much.